In this episode of Untold Chapters, I'm joined by Marion Gamble, one of our esteemed children's authors. We will be discussing her inspirations, writing processes, and the importance of reading in early years. Hello, Marion. How are you today?
I'm okay, thank you.
Good. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, Marion?
Yes, okay. I've spent most of my working life in the fields of childcare and education, working with children of all ages, but specifically younger children in more recent years. And it was only after I retired and my grandchildren were born that I wrote anything down. I used to make up stories for and with the children when I was working with them, but at that point didn't think of writing anything down.
You've published many charming children's books over the last 10 years with us and over a variety of themes and characters. So I see that working in childcare inspired you to start writing for young readers. But is there anything in particular that inspired you to start putting it down on paper?
Yes, the birth of my grandchildren. I've got three grandsons, and it was after the eldest one was born. I thought I'd write some stories for him, and it's gone on from there, really.
That's really sweet. Does he have a personal favourite?
Well, I think he likes all of them, really.
Yeah.
I've now got three grandsons. Um, the first one I wrote, Jack is my eldest grandson, so two of the stories have his name, and then William was the second one. He's got a story. And then the third one is Alistair, so perhaps I'll have to write a story for him as well.
Oh, that's so sweet. I didn't realise that's what they were named after. Many of your books feature animals and creatures. Why do you think that children are so drawn to stories about animals, and how do you choose which animals or creatures to focus on in your books?
Well, I think many children have pets and are already familiar with animals. Most of the animals and creatures in the stories, they have human characteristics and are lovable and relatable for children. When I go into schools and nurseries for story sessions, the children love the Booty Monster story, and I have a puppet that I use along with the story. It's a hairy, scary purple monster, but he's really quite friendly.
Do you think that tends to be a personal favourite with the children then because of the puppet?
Yes, that's one of the favourites, certainly. I've got puppets and characters or cuddly toys to go with each of the stories.
Was there any specific inspiration that helped you come up with a booty monster, or was it kind of a spark of genius?
Well, again, it was my grandsons live in Australia, and when we were visiting, Jack was 2.5 at the time, and he was into monsters. We played a monster game every day, and he just enjoyed that. You know, the monsters in the cupboard, the monsters hiding in the garden, and we just had such a lot of fun playing this monster game. That gave me the inspiration to write the story.
It's so nice how involved the stories are with your family. They've got such a nice sentimental value.
Yes, yeah, I think, and you know, we just have. I mean, all my stories, I hope, are fun for children. A little bit scary, a couple of them, but not too scary. And children like that.
They do like to be a little bit scared, don't they?
As long as they're in a safe environment and you've got an adult to reassure them, they do like to be a little bit scared.
It's good to help them expand their imagination, I think.
Absolutely, yes.
Moving on from that, how do you approach creating stories that aren't only fun, but they also help promote development in children, as this is seen across many of your books?
Well, all of my books are designed to encourage communication, language development, and imagination. When I worked, my last job in childcare was as an early years advisor, and I saw so many children going into school with poor language skills. So that's one of my aims, is to encourage language and communication. And 5 of the stories have rhyming text, which helps with language development. William Likes to Bounce is also to promote movement and physical development. So specifically aimed at certain aspects of development.
I noticed that on the back of the books, in the blurb, it also tells parents what kind of development skills are helped to expand in your books, which I think is really nice. It tells a parent what they're purchasing when they're buying the book. Where do you typically find inspirations for your story? I know you mentioned with family and real life experiences. Have you ever come up with one completely new with different characters and worlds off the top of your head, or has it always got a backstory behind it?
Well, I think I've got a vivid imagination, but there's
Yeah.
usually something that something that sparked it. Mooncat, which was the first one, came about. My husband and I were walking round past the farm on a moonlit night, and there was a cat hunting in the borders. And the next day, the children I was working with, I was telling them about this cat, and we had such a conversation about what was the cat doing, and the cat was hunting, what was happening, all the other creatures that might be out at night, and that sparked the story, really.
You mentioned that Mooncat is one of your favorites of your books. Why do you feel like this one resonates with you the most?
Well, it was the first one to be published, so that I felt was really quite an achievement when I first had the books delivered and in my hand, because even though I'd signed a contract, I kind of didn't really expect it to happen. So it was just very special in that sense. And again, the book has got rhyming text and different animals in, and the kind of things that children enjoy, I think.
I can imagine having the book in your hands for the first time then. It was such a surreal experience, especially with working with
Yes.
children. It's allowed you to tell them that story at work and then bring it back in with you and say, look at what I've done, look at this story. I bet they loved it.
Yes, they did. And after, when I first told them the story, a couple of days later, after we'd made up a story, one of the children said, "Will you tell us that story again?" And I said, "Which story?" Because we do other stories.
Yeah.
And he said, "The one about the moon cat." So he actually gave me the title.
Oh, that's such a nice little story behind it. Did the children particularly like having the book as a physical object?
Yes, I think so. And I'm all for children having actual books. I know a lot of things are online now, but I think for young children, an actual book is preferable, in my opinion.
I can imagine also seeing the characters come to life from what you've had in your head and what the children have been describing. I bet that was a nice process to go through.
Yes, yes, very much so.
How do you balance creating stories that are both fun for the children and meaningful for the parents and educators?
Well, I hope to encourage communication between children and parents or other adults, and inspire a love of books and curiosity, which should prompt children to ask questions. And I think also humour is important. So for the adult reader and the child listener. Um, so I think encouraging communication. I think it's all too often children are not always listened to, and I think that communication between parents or adults with the child is so important.
I completely agree. I feel like, especially having illustrations in a book, all of yours are picture books. It really helps children explain what they mean and developed their communication skills. Because, like you said, children aren't always taken very seriously. So, for an adult or a child to read a book with each other, giving them that opportunity to say what they have in their head without any judgment, I feel like that's really important for a child to feel like they sort of belong.
Yes, I think reading with children, young children, it's such a special time. It's such a lovely thing to do. Um, and I just think it's so important. Bedtime stories, but anytime stories, really.
Definitely. What advice would you give to any aspiring writers, especially those that are looking to create stories for children?
Well, first of all, I think you need to like children, to have an affinity with them. Immerse yourself in a child's world, really. But if you believe in what you're doing, don't give up. Getting published is quite difficult. And I think also write a really good covering letter about yourself to send in with your manuscript, something that makes you stand out, because there's so many people send things in to publishers. So I think you need a really good letter explaining about your background.
It's definitely a good place to get your title noticed.
Yes, I think so.
I also feel like you said, your grandchildren and your children inspired your stories. So I feel like for any aspiring authors, it's really important to take notice of things that are happening around you as you go through life for inspiration, because I feel like that's where a lot of people struggle to think of something to write about when there's things around you on the day-to-day that you could write an amazing story about that you just need to take notice of?
Almost anything can spark an idea for a story, really. I've got a file of possible stories for the future. Whether I'll ever do anything with them, I'm not sure, but I think anything can spark, an idea for a story.
Yeah, and to make sure that you always write everything down. Like you said, you've got your files, so you won't forget if they're all written down.
Yes, that's quite important, I think. It can be overhearing a conversation or something that a child says or something that you actually see in the environment. It can be literally anything.
Have you had any recent inspirations?
Not specifically, because I've been busy with other things, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But I say I will return to this file at some point and think about perhaps doing something else.
Well, at least you've got a nice little collection of ideas that you've not let slip through the cracks.
No.
So we'll move on to a couple questions about specific books. So in Jack Wants a Pet, we can find that pets are often a child's first introduction to responsibility. What lessons do you wish that children will take away from Jack's journey to finding a pet?
Well, in the story, Jack doesn't end up actually getting a pet. All the animals in the story are wild animals and perhaps not suitable for being in captivity. But it's a fun story and an ideal introduction to Australian Indigenous animals. I find Australian animals are quite unique and fascinating. They're totally different to anywhere else. And there's so much to talk about in the story about the habitats, where do the animals live, the diets, what do they eat, different categories of animals. Obviously, they've got marsupials, animals with pouches, monotremes, which are animals which lay eggs, quite unique to Australia, I believe. Eventually, Jack did get a pet dog, but not obviously the ones in the story because they're
Yeah.
wild animals.
Yeah, I find Australian animals so amazing because obviously in the UK we just have quite standard animals like dogs and cats and horses, and then we have foxes, etc. But they have all the big spiders and snakes, and I feel like writing stories about Australian animals kind of helps children get over any of that fear that they may have, or even just curiosity that they hold over animals in other countries. But like I said, I feel like a lot of children are scared of those sorts of animals that they have in other countries. So I feel like writing a nice, fun book about them is a good way to introduce them into that side of things.
Yes, I think so. And also discussing these things with the children, talking about them, and perhaps talking about where is Australia using a map or a globe to explain. The story can just as be a starting point and go in many different directions, linking to all areas of the curriculum. And I think that applies to all my stories, really.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially, you could like count the animals in the books. That could be mathematics and geography, like you said, speaking about
Absolutely.
where Australia is.
Yes, that's the aim, that it'll encourage questions and discussion with the child and the adults.
Yeah, and a lot of the time you can't even begin to imagine what questions a child might have about a book. So it's interesting to see what they come out with because it's probably something that you didn't even consider while you were writing the book.
Yeah, they usually have wonderful questions, sometimes questions I can't answer.
Yeah.
But then it gives you the opportunity to explore that and find out the answer for, with the child.
Yeah, and it helps you learn more about your own writing then.
Absolutely, yes.
So, in Elephant Hubble Goes to School, which is your most recent title that you've published with us, it tackles school-related challenges such as learning to read. What inspired this story, and how did you decide to use an elephant as the main character?
Well, during lockdown, I was commissioned to write a story by a reading charity about their elephant mascot. There was no particular brief, just for slightly older children, more or less like a school reader. So I wrote about a mischievous elephant with a specific highlight on the kind of problems that many children and elephants have when learning to read. And also to help parents understand the genuine problems. Some children just learn differently. And simple things can make a huge difference. If children are struggling with reading, they need to go back to basics, learning the letter sounds correctly, using phonics and a multisensory approach, and daily reading practice can make a huge difference. The story also has information about Africa and facts about elephants, providing an opportunity for questions and discussion.
Yeah, I think it's so important for us to make children feel accepted, especially when they're struggling to learn something that their peers may not have problems with. So I feel like having a book such as Elephant Hubble Goes to School, it really helps them feel as if they're not different from everyone else, and it makes them feel like their challenges are accepted and that they're going to be helped and they're not going to have to struggle along the way on their own.
Yes, I've had feedback from a mum who's got a 9-year-old daughter who struggles with reading, and she's found the book extremely useful. And as you say, the child now feels she's not on her own. In almost every classroom, there are probably children who are struggling with reading.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think it's important to have books with characters that may have some learning difficulties for children to relate to, because we're in a time where we're much more aware of difficulties and learning difficulties that children may have that may not have been recognized in the past. So it's good for education for teachers and parents as well to know that these things are prevalent and that is something that they can help with instead of just having to let the child kind of figure it out on their own.
Yes, as I say, often simple things can make a huge difference. And it's going back to basics and using a multisensory approach. Young children learn through all the senses, and that has to be continued with older children who are struggling with reading. And it does work. And daily reading practice. When I was working as a volunteer for this charity, I used to go into schools once a week, but I used to encourage the children to try and read every day a little bit, 10 minutes or something, because that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, and even carrying that through into adult life is really important because obviously learning doesn't stop when you get out of school. So I think reading is such an important part of life for everyone, not even just children.
I think reading is, absolutely essential to get by in this world. You need reading for everything and for all their other lessons in school. If they haven't got good reading ability, it can affect everything else. So I just think it's really important.
Me too, especially when a child might not enjoy reading, so then they decide that they're not going to. I feel like sometimes they don't realize that reading is everywhere. It's not even just for school, it's for reading things at the shops so they know what they're buying,
Absolutely.
or reading things on their phone when they get a bit older. That if they can't read, they will be missing out on a lot of life, really. So, like you said, reading is such an integral part of a development of a child.
Yes, as I say, and it affects everything else if the reading is poor. I did find some children who could read quite well, but their comprehension was really poor. They didn't understand what they'd read. So that's another area that needs to be people need to be aware of to encourage them and explain new words and things to them. If they can read but don't understand what they're reading, that again is a real problem.
Yeah, I feel like that's something a lot of people don't kind of consider as well. So they might see that a child is reading well, like you said, but understanding what they're reading is a completely different kind of ball game, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Do you have anything that you might want to share with anyone that might be listening?
Well, I'm just passionate about children having access to good books and stories and children being able to read well. And I just hope my stories can play a small part in achieving that. And generally, they've been popular with children, parents, teachers, librarians, early years workers. As I say, I've had good feedback for each of the stories. But as an unknown person, it's difficult to get the word out there and further afield, really.
And hopefully, this episode of Untold Chapters will help you boost some of that engagement for you.
I hope so. Thank you.
No worries. That's all the questions I had today. Thank you for joining me, Marion. It's been lovely to speak with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Untold Chapters. If you are listening on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you're a Spotify listener, remember to follow and give this episode a 5-star rating.